Good morning. Welcome to Convocation. Good morning. Thank you. All right, have a seat if you haven't found one yet. This morning, we are excited to welcome Dr. Bernadette Barton. I don't think we have any campus announcements, so in order to introduce Dr. Barton's talk, I will first welcome to the stage Bethel College Women's Association Representative Margaret Taves. Margaret?
Good morning. I'm Margaret Taves, Treasurer of Bethel College Women's Association, which we abbreviate to BCWA. BCWA was started approximately 80 years ago. One of its purposes was and is to provide financial support for the college. Carolyn Schultz was a leader with BCWA for 20 years back in the 1970s and the 1980s. And the funds that bring Dr. Barton here today are in her honor. To honor her work, BCWA started the Carolyn Schultz Lectureship Endowment Fund in the spring of 1991. We wrote to Carolyn a few months ago to tell her who was coming this year, and she wrote back, "Thank you so much for the exciting news of bringing outstanding women to the campus with the Endowment Fund. I am very proud of the endowed lectureship in my honor. We look forward to the new ideas this year's presenters bring to the college." Thank you.
Thank you to Bethel College Women's Association. And then to introduce our speaker, I have Dr. Rachel Messer.
I am so pleased today to introduce Dr. Bernadette Barton, who is a professor of sociology and the new director of gender studies at Morehead State University in Morehead, Kentucky, which happens to be where I got my undergraduate education, so I'm especially excited that she's here. She received her PhD in sociology and a graduate certificate in gender studies from the University of Kentucky in 2000. Originally from Massachusetts, she's lived in central Kentucky and taught in eastern Kentucky since 1992, where she's undertaken substantial research on American culture's characterization of sexuality, religion, gender, and the sex industry, just a few light topics, right? She's the author of several books, such as 2012's Pray the Gay Away, The Extraordinary Lives of Bible Belt Gays, and her most recent 2017 book is called Stripped, More Stories from Exotic Dancers. She's given lectures around the U.S., and today's talk is entitled Research as Social Justice. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Barton.
Hi, everyone. It's so nice to be here. Thank you for having me. Thanks for calling me an outstanding woman. I appreciate that. Thanks very much to the Bethel Women's Association for supplying the funds to bring me here. So I've just been on campus. I got here last night at 8 o'clock, and I've been researching the school to just sort of find out a little bit about you. And the more I hear about Bethel College, the more I find myself in alignment with a lot of your values, especially values to do with social justice and faith in action and a rejection of violence as a way to solve problems. What I'm going to be sharing with you today is basically 30 years of projects that all have a social justice core and direction, and show you what it means to do social justice scholarship. So the body of work that I'm going to be talking to you about today has a few things in common. First of all, these are all projects that I'm incredibly interested in and continue to be interested in. So I am personally invested in all the topics that I'm going to be talking about. And I have a lifelong relationship with the ideas. So my ideas continue to grow and transform. So you young people out here, as you think about what's important to you, what are your values, what do you want to create in the world, how do you want to be a good citizen? Think about what interests you and how you can create from that. One of the ideas that I'm especially fascinated by is the mechanics of transformation. So how do people go from having one point of view to a different point of view? So all my projects have a kernel of exploring transformation in them. I personally have a passion for social justice. I feel like it's what makes my life meaningful is to create work in the world that makes people's lives better. And partly I do that by exploring the lives of people on the margins. And how I do it, I'm going to go through all of these throughout the talk, is that I try to enjoy what I do. I think we should be doing things we like. We should be having fun. Our lives should be fun. So I balance focus, the pleasure of creativity, and just the enjoyment of studying something that I find interesting. So I'm going to start with my master's thesis that I did between 1992 and 1994, which is probably before a lot of you were even born. This was my most, kind of my lightest projects. I did a research project exploring Star Trek fans. Now, my interest in Star Trek fandom is, personal. I'm a Star Trek fan. Anybody here a Star Trek fan? Oh, yeah. Yeah, a few of you, okay. All right, well, my exposure to Star Trek, the original series, began when I was 6 or 7 years old, my family was living in Oregon there, I remember, and I would watch it. I was just so excited about it as a little kid. And then one day it was gone, and there was like some Adam 12, like a cop show was on instead. And I was just completely horrified that they took off my favorite show and put on a police show. So I wrote a letter to the news station saying, how could you do this to me? As my little 7-year-old said. So my mom mailed it out, and I actually got a response from the director of the news station who said, we've shown every episode of Star Trek, all 66 episodes, 44 times. And when the audience has had enough time to get, remember it, to forget the narratives, we'll put it back on the air again. And indeed they did, like a year or so later. So that was just kind of a fun little moment of me like talking back, I was upset about this. So anyway, I've always loved the narrative of Star Trek because it's set in this utopic world where there's no poverty and no racism and no sexism. And so right in 1992, this was when The Next Generation was really big. And right now there's the new Picard series, if any of you are watching that. So what I did was I joined a Star Trek fan club in Lexington, Kentucky, because my master's thesis was exploring whether hardcore fans were more likely to be politically progressive given their involvement with the series, which to me seemed very social justice oriented. Like, how could you not watch Star Trek and be someone who was politically progressive? But actually, after doing months of research, going to the fan club meetings, going to the charity events, going to a Star Trek convention where I met Scotty, the actor Scotty, I found out that no, it didn't mean that at all, that Star Trek fans, in fact, bring their political orientations to the text. So if they were progressive, they would indeed look at the no racism, no sexism, no poverty, but if they were politically conservative, they would look at Star Trek and appreciate the Prime Directive and the space battles. So that was just an interesting, fun topic to explore. So I'm in grad school, and I'm coming up with my dissertation research, and now I'm going to do something that's more focused on gender, because I was passionate about feminism and sexuality and dancing. And this picture here that's me in the front, at the very top. I was a ballet dancer. I went to a performing arts high school, and I studied dance very intensely. I was going to be a professional dancer, go to New York City. I wasn't even going to go to college. But my life got derailed after that when I developed injuries in my hips. And I know a lot of you are athletes. So maybe you understand this idea of your body hitting a limit and just no matter what you do, you can't get any better. It's a very upsetting and terrifying thing, but it happens. And I guess if you're here athletes, you probably, hopefully you haven't reached that limit and hopefully you won't. But for me, that was a very transformative moment. I had to quit dance, and at least not that path to become a professional ballerina. But that dance background really influenced what I was interested in exploring. So I thought, well, what about the lives of exotic dancers? What's that like? And I remember being in college, probably your age, and this was before the internet. And I was always broke. Raise your hand if you're always broke. Anybody in here? Okay. So I would look at the newspaper. We had newspapers then, and I would look for the help wanted signs, and there would always be these ads that say dancers, dancers, dancers across the top. And I would always, even though I knew, I would look at that and think, I'm a dancer. And but then it would be for stripping. I was like, I don't want to really do that. But then I would be frustrated. It's like, I spent 9 years doing that. Surely I should have some skill at the end of it that I could make money out of. So I was always interested in those women that decided to make money off of dancing. So I wrote a book. I wrote actually 2 books on exotic dancers. The white cover one you just saw was the original book, and then this is the completely revised edition that came out in 2017. And the first book was great. It was a good book. It was my first book. But the second book, I didn't even plan to write. A young woman in my sex industry class did an honors project on exotic dancers, and she found such amazing data. I hired her to help me collect more data, and then I completely revised the book. So that was really fun. My editor was really excited for me to revise it. She said, we want to keep the backlist fresh. So between the 2 books, I've done 60 interviews with exotic dancers, lots and lots of hours of observation in strip clubs. And that project was full of challenges. I had a hard time. You remember the Star Trek project? It was pretty clear. I had a clear question and a clear answer. With the stripping project, I wasn't as clear what I wanted to know. I was sort of like, what's it like to be a dancer? So it took me a while to find the argument of the work. And the book really looks at how dancing working in the sex industry can be positive for some women at first, not for all women. Some women is always negative. But that what is positive about dancing changes over time. And I talk about this as the toll of stripping. That's one of my main arguments. So a challenge that I faced doing the research for this project was the field work. So going into strip clubs was just an uncomfortable experience. And most clubs, or many clubs, probably at least 50% of clubs, require women to have a male escort when they enter the club. So that alone was a barrier. So there was many, many barriers to doing this work and to getting the data collected. I experienced all kind of harassment in the clubs. So it was just a little bit precarious. And then I experienced what Irving Goffman calls, he's a sociological theorist, sticky stigma. So because I researched, sticky stigma is stigma that attaches from a stigmatized population to anyone near them. So it could be something like, you've got a gay friend, or you're hanging out with a gay friend, you must be gay too because you're hanging out with a gay friend. Anybody ever hear that kind of thing before? Okay, that's sticky stigma. So for me, the sticky stigma with stripping was, you're studying exotic dancers, why would anybody study them? You must be a dancer, that's the only reason you would be interested in it. So that was a little bit challenging to deal with. But definitely an enormously interesting project, and I think that the lives of women who work in the sex industry have a lot to tell us about living in a patriarchal culture. Okay, so after, in between those 2 books, in between the first and the revised editions of Stripped, I started a new project. I did a whole other book. And this was on being gay in the Bible Belt. And it started in 2004. My wife and I, although at that time we weren't married, we'd been together, I think 4 years, and 6 years. And we moved from Lexington, Kentucky to a small town only about 20 miles east of Lexington toward my college, Morehead State University, where I was working. And I grew up in a politically progressive family and had lived in Massachusetts and California, so I'd lived in very politically progressive places. And then when I moved to Lexington, Kentucky, I was really, honestly, completely surrounded by gay people when I moved there. My landladies were gay, my thesis advisor was gay, I was working for my research, director was gay. It was like everybody was a lesbian that was around, so I was like, oh, it's just like San Francisco here. I was mistaken. So I came out, and then, bumps along the way with that. But, I came out. But then when I moved to Thomasville, I call it in the book, that's when I really first noticed homophobia. I was very blind to it. I just thought, why would anybody be homophobic? Who cares? It just seemed like such an outdated notion that I couldn't imagine that anyone really thought that way. So here it is, 2004, and we had just moved into this house that we got for a steal, what I thought was a steal, coming from places where the housing market was a lot more expensive. Anyway, I'm in the backyard and I'm digging up a plot that's maybe like this big, not very big, and I'm gonna plant in some tomatoes and pepper plants. Next door to me is a neighbor who's 90-something, and she had an area that was maybe the size of this whole section of the auditorium. And she was one of those mamas that grew everything in the world. Does anyone have one of those in your life? Yeah, the best vegetables. Well, anyway, she had someone from her church there tilling up her area and getting it ready for her. And he saw me digging in my little yard, and he kept offering to come over and dig it for me, till it. He kept offering. He was so persistent, and I kept trying to deflect him, and finally I was like, whatever, fine, come on over, till it. So what? You know, it's like I finally said yes. And he came over, and then after he finished, he asked me if I was married. So, and you know how that goes. You're like, that seems like a precursor to asking somebody on a date. And I was a little bit unsure how to answer that question because I didn't understand, like I wasn't clear about how homophobic it was, and then I wasn't exactly married. And so I think I said no. And then he asked me what church I went to. That's a super Bible Belt question, right? Who's been asked what church you go to before? Yeah, so that answer, you get a lot of information about a person when they answer what church they go to. So at that point, I'm like a little bit upset with myself for saying I wasn't married when I had a very significant partner who I would have been married to had marriage been legal. So I said to him, I don't attend any of the churches around here. I'm in a lesbian relationship and they're not very supportive of it. So you can kind of imagine that didn't go over so well. So then he said, it's an abomination. And I was like, I can't believe somebody's talking to me like this. Like, who actually talks like this? So I was stunned and horrified. And then we had a long, protracted conversation where I'm trying to get rid of him, and he starts talking about beating his kids, and it just went on in this very weird and creepy way. Till he finally leaves, and I'm a little stirred up about it and upset. So I go in to tell Anna, my partner, and she was aggravated at me for letting him in the backyard to begin with. She's like, why did you let him in there? You know, you're not supposed to let people in the backyard. She's from Eastern Kentucky, and it's like they're very territorial about their yards. And she knows you got to be careful who you reveal yourself to, because she knew a lot more about homophobia than me. And then I told my mom, who was horrified and wanted me to move. And then, so it was all these responses. My gay friends in Kentucky were like, duh, what were you thinking? So all this was what is it like to grow up in the Bible Belt? What's it like to grow up hearing these kinds of homophobic messages all the time? And my story, I'm not trying to say my story is a big deal at all. My story is teeny, tiny little illustration of homophobia compared to what I collected for the stories of Bible Belt gay people. So this project just sucked my soul out. This was a lot of work. I interviewed 59 gay men and lesbians from around the Bible Belt, and I've spoken to hundreds more in talks like this, and I've been a repository of all kinds of horrible stories about bad experiences with families and churches. I did ethnography, autoethnography, and content analysis. Ethnography meaning it's an anthropological method where you immerse yourself in a culture. So I was immersed in a culture that's foreign to me, and the culture that was foreign to me was conservative Christian culture. And then autoethnography is when you're a member of the culture you're immersed in, and I was living in a same-sex relationship in the Bible Belt. So there was that biographical part. And then I also did content analysis of conservative Christian media. So news programming, websites, flyers, commercials. And the book explores what it's like to grow up gay in a homophobic family, church, or community, how it affects a gay child, youth, or adult to hear homophobic messages, and basically what does it mean to be a Bible Belt gay. So that book I'm really proud of that book. It was interesting to write, but hard. Now I'm just going to give you a little nugget to take away and to sort of show one of the main reasons why there's so much religious homophobia, opposition to gay people. And we'll start with how do social scientists measure sexual orientation? Let's just take a moment. You want to take a guess? Anybody want to guess? What would be the 3 things? Oops. Yes?
Sexual experience.
Behavior? Yep, behavior is one. Good for you. 2 more. Anybody want to try? Yep. What? Yes, that's one. Attraction is one. There's one more. It's the hardest one. Identity. Identity. Okay, so we've got attraction, behavior, and identity, and that's what makes up our sexual orientation. So let's just kind of talk this through a second so it's clear to you. Now think about attraction. So think about when you've been attracted to people before. It's great if your attractions line up with your behavior and it lines up with your identity. So if you say, I'm attracted to men, and I sleep with men, and I'm a heterosexual woman. You see how that all lines up? It's in alignment, okay. But it doesn't always line up that easily. So let's talk about attraction. So can you think of a time when you were attracted to someone that was inappropriate to be attracted to, and you didn't act on it, but you felt this attraction for someone that you wouldn't act on, but you felt it, and you couldn't control it? Raise your hand. Don't be shy, have it 5 times a day. I mean, it's okay. It's like, unless you're asexual, it's a normal part of being human, is to feel attractions. There's nothing wrong with that. Okay, now let's talk about behavior. Have you ever been in a sexual encounter with someone, and then you're in the middle of it, and you're like, bad idea. Not attracted to this person. Anybody? Yeah, me too. Yeah. And in fact, so behavior does not need to be connected to attraction. In fact, there's a whole group of people that have sexual behavior with people with no attraction, sex workers. So, and then finally there's identity, and identity is what you call yourself. And you totally get to pick your identity. So, for example, public health researchers have a category called MSM, which is men who have sex with men. And they call it that to capture men who have sex with men, but who refuse the label of bisexual or gay. So they're attracted to men, they sleep with men, but they don't call themselves gay or bisexual. Y'all get that? Okay, so again, these things can go together, but they don't necessarily. Now, what happens with conservative Christian theology and ideology about homosexuality is that conservative Christians confuse behavior with orientation. They make it all about the behavior, and they miss those other 2 dimensions. Now, behavior, yes, is something we can control, but attraction is something we cannot control. So orientation is real complex to talk about and think about, because some people experience their orientation, in fact, most of us experience our orientation as very fixed, that it doesn't really change. But then there are some people who do experience a little bit of fluidity. The people that I interviewed for my project on being gay in the Bible Belt, they really experienced their orientation in a born that way. So no matter how much they prayed, no matter how much therapy they were not going to be able to stop being attracted to the same sex. It was impossible. The only thing they could do is not act on it, but then that led to a pretty grim and awful and challenging life. Not to mention the dimension of feeling like God doesn't love you for something that you were seemingly created with. It's paradoxical and harmful. It's a kind of spiritual violence, I would argue. Okay, so my research happened in this region. I explored this area of the country, the Bible Belt, a term coined by H.L. Mencken during the monkey trials back in the late 19th century. And it looks like Kansas is kind of, I don't know, do you all consider Kansas the Bible Belt or not? It's sort of like a quarter of it's in there. I know that there's probably some conservative religious influences in this area of the country. So I characterize the Bible Belt as a place where conservative religious ideas have a lot more play in mainstream culture than in other areas of the country. That people are much more likely to talk about their Christianity and to defer to Christian authorities in the Bible Belt than in other places. So, in talking about Christianity and homosexuality, it's important for me to distinguish between sin, fall, and liberation creation frameworks. And this framework, this paradigm, this schema, I borrowed from Bishop Gene Robinson, who's the first openly gay ordained bishop in the Episcopalian Church. So Christians that adhere to a sin-fall framework have a literal belief in the Bible. They think that humans are sinful, inherently born with original sin. Think that their faith is the right faith and that all other faiths are wrong. Tend to be hierarchical with male leadership and church dogma referencing male deities, and are opposed to secular humanism. Liberation creation Christians tend instead to see the Bible as an inspired text and may have a mystical interpretation of sin and hell. They tend to be ecumenical and appreciate other faiths and use more non-gendered language and ordain women and openly gay people. So when you think about your church, it's kind of fun. I do this in my religion and sexuality class. I have a scale of 0 to 10. I say, where does your church fall on the sin, fall, liberation, creation framework? And a lot of times it's somewhere in between. Okay, so one of my early challenges with this work was perceiving fundamentalism, because I had been raised Catholic in Massachusetts. And it was a kind of Catholic light too. It was after Vatican II, and they had gotten rid of some of the more, there wasn't as much talk about hell and sin when I went to Catholic church. So I remember even being a little kid and being scared of hell and talking to my mom, and she said, "Oh, don't worry about hell, Bernadette. Only Hitler goes to hell. You know, we have purgatory." Yeah, I was literally told that. I was like, phew, that sounds good to me. All in on that. So, and then the Catholics are terrible for ignoring their rules. It's like, you know, nobody does, so people were definitely having premarital sex, or having extramarital sex, they were using birth control, and nobody was paying any attention to it. And so I just thought that was the way it was. If there's a rule, and it's a bad rule, you just ignore it. That's what you do. That's what the Catholics do. So, I mean, I even questioned Catholic authorities, like priests, and I would say, well, how come nobody's following this rule? And they'd be like, shh, don't worry about it. The church hasn't caught up to people's lived experiences, so just go to Mass, and you'll be fine. Do you see how that religious socialization made me think that, that's what everybody does. Nobody follows the rules. You just go to Mass, and I thought that was fine. I liked Mass, so I thought, okay, I can do that. But then when I started researching conservative Christianity, I realized that people were actually trying to follow the rules, even when it was inconvenient for them. And Celia's story was one of the first interviews that really made me think about that. She was talking, she was 40 years old, and we had met in the library to do her interview in a room. And she was talking about her favorite aunt, who had rejected her and her partner because they were lesbians, in a lesbian relationship. And I said, well, what if you said to your aunt, I love you, Aunt Joanne, and you're my favorite aunt, and it's so important to me what you think, and why can't Jennifer come to Thanksgiving dinner? And Celia just got really confused and started crying and said she thought her aunt would say, well, it's not up to me. It's God's feelings. God's the only one who matters. God doesn't like it. So it's like her aunt gets a free pass from what she's actually doing to Celia and Jennifer by putting it off on, this is God's law and I'm just following it. I don't want to hurt you. I'm just doing what God says. And I've heard a lot of that over the years, and especially so I'm from the place where Kim Davis is. Did you hear about this? Do you remember this? Back in 2015? Well, Morehead, Kentucky, where I teach, that's the county that was in the news. It was her. And her whole ideology was centered around this idea that I'm just upholding the word of God. I'm just a vehicle for God. And so that was her excuse, her rationale. She felt like she couldn't issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples because she would be risking her own salvation. So I'm actually doing a project on this now. I've finished up Pray the Gay Away, and I'm working on this project with the Social Movement Service. We've been interviewing marriage equality activists and religious freedom activists in the region, in Kentucky. So when it was going on, it was very intense. Whoa, the energy was amazing. So it was just down the street from my school. And this is the courthouse. This is just a picture I snapped outside the courthouse before the ruling had happened, before she even went to jail. I don't know if you remember, she went to jail for like 3 or 4 days. So here are the protesters, and here are the counter-protesters, and it was like a circus. And then the media presence was just intense. So, but one of the takeaways as I work on this project is that sometimes, and you probably know this as well, that people who are in urban parts of the country or the coast tend to look at states like Kentucky and I bet Kansas as places where just hicks live and nothing really happens, like flyover states. So, and that certainly like gay people in Kentucky would be just like victims, you know? And so what our project does is sort of highlight the heroism and the multifaceted personalities and energy of those who are in Kentucky. You know, gay people, LGBT people in Kentucky are more than victims. They're actors. And I know the same is true of Kansas. Okay, I'm sorry, there's gonna be a few little sexually graphic, slightly graphic images here, so sorry, bear with me. Now I'm into another project. This is a book that will be coming out this year on raunch culture. The book's gonna be called Porn in the USA, How Raunch Culture is Ruining America. So, skipping away from, but this project actually links to my work on stripping. So raunch culture, this is the culture that you have grown up in. Hypersexualized culture in which the sex industry sets the standard for what is attractive. So what we see now is like a pornified representation of what women especially should look like in the media. Raunch culture really, there is hypersexual imagery before the mid-90s, like I described here, but it was, the mid-90s was a time when the internet became more and more dominant. So the representations of raunch culture amped up with the internet, and especially with internet pornography. So I'm sure you've gotten messages in your life that the most important thing you can be if you're a woman is to be hot, like a porn star or stripper. But you better not be a porn star or stripper, just be hot like them, because actual porn stars and strippers still experience a ton of stigma. Some would argue even that internet pornography, pornography was driving the development of the internet. There's some studies to show that. And that the representations in internet pornography are filtering down into mainstream culture, the soft porn version. Okay, so another dimension of raunch culture that's different that's changed, is that it includes a dimension of self-objectification, where girls and young women are told that you should present yourself as sexy, and if you do, you're empowered. Like, go be sexy, and like, look at you, you get to be sexy and wear those stripper shoes. Don't you showing what a powerful woman you are? And my students told me about this thing called Yeti budding. So it's like, so why? Like, how is this happening? What's going on? This sort of Orwellian doublespeak. And to me, what it looks like is sex work without the money. Like, historically, women do that. They should be at least getting paid to do that, as opposed to the weak value of, oh, look at you, you're so empowered, you know. Another phenomenon that happens with raunch culture is that because it's become the dominant culture, it's invisible to us. I argue that it suffers from a condition of inarticulation, which is a concept I developed in my book, Pray the Gay Away, when I talked about the toxic closet and how gay people are silenced from speaking about their lives. They suffer under a condition of inarticulation. So this picture that's there, this was actually, my grad assistant snapped this picture for me outside of our student center in 2016. And you can see the students walking down the stairs, backpacks. And it was just hanging out there, right there, as everyone went by, the students, the faculty, the administrators, the guests. And my school is not the most progressive school. I don't think that anyone was like, oh yeah, let's go sexualize women. I think what happened is it got hung up by the bookstore and nobody noticed. Nobody noticed. We're so used to seeing images like that it's invisible to us. It's like raunch culture is the water and we're the fish. But let's take it apart. What does it mean that we're so used to seeing images like this? Like, how does it affect us? And that's what my new book explores. Now, what happens if something's suffering a condition of inarticulation? What happens if we don't have words for something? Well, if we don't have words for it, we can't talk about it, we can't critique it, and we can't change it. So my social justice work with my Raunch Culture Project is to help give us words to talk about this stuff with, as opposed to just letting it marinate in our brains, affecting us, what we think of as good and sexy and meaningful. So raunch culture is just everywhere, and I could share dozens and dozens and dozens of images, but this image was powerful to me because it was on the cover of National Geographic. Now, I know this is not the sexiest image you've ever seen, but how come the women there have to be topless? Like, why? Like, what did you say?
The men are topless too.
What does that mean? The same thing? And I would say it probably doesn't, because topless women in our society are sexualized in a way that topless men are not. Thank you. Okay, so raunch culture can be complicated to talk about. Opinions differ on raunch culture. And what makes it complicated is that what I'm doing, and I can't really go into as many details as I was like, is I'm making an institutional critique, not an individual critique. I'm critiquing the structure, not how individuals figure out their lives within the structure. It is not up to me to decide what an individual should do. So Candace's story is a good illustration. She was an exotic dancer that I interviewed that was working at a strip club in Lexington, and she was 20-something. She was honestly one of the least, like the worst paid dancers, but they usually make at least a couple $100s a shift. She had not made $60 in a shift after working there for 4 months, which was amazing that she was even still doing it. But the reason why, I speculate, is because she grew up in a very religious home, and she was using stripping as a way to resist her religious conservative background. It was like a place for her to go party and get away from her kids. So for Candace, stripping is a respite from religiosity. And I think sometimes for people who are steeped in raunch culture, religion can be a respite from raunch culture. So what I'm doing here is focusing on the forest, not the trees. Let me give you another example. I was just interviewed by a reporter for the BBC about stripping and about, I guess, Lizzo was seen in a strip club. And some people were critiquing her as not being feminist for going into a strip club. And the reporter wanted me to talk on that. And I just said that it's not up to me to police anybody's feminism, and I don't really like call-out culture. And I appreciate Lizzo for what she does, and everybody's experience and negotiation of the culture is their own way. And I feel like as women, we should stick together. So that's how I feel about individual choices within raunch culture. However, I still feel like I can critique raunch culture. I can say that it presents this very hegemonic idea, and it forces people to conform to it, and it perpetuates rape culture and toxic masculinity. I also argue that raunch culture is just one side of the same coin as purity culture. So both of these cultures, purity culture and raunch culture, seek to control women's sexual expression. One by saying, you should be pure, you shouldn't have sex except within a heterosexual marriage. One saying, you should be sexy for men and putting yourself out there, and that's empowering. So both of these cultures is about organizing women's sexuality for men. Okay, so kind of a really whirlwind tour through a bunch of my projects. Another way that I do social justice work with these projects is that I try to keep my work out in the public as much as possible. I consider myself a public sociologist. So I just feel like it's important to get your ideas out there if you're in academia. So I've given lots of big talks on this material. I respond to media requests whenever I can. I love that professors use my work in their classrooms. That's really exciting. I consider my teaching with my students a kind of activism, where I continue to share ideas and help them negotiate their own thoughts and values about the systems of oppression that we discuss. And I basically just try to insert my work into public conversations where I can. So here I'm gonna leave us with some tips for how for you to do your own kind of social justice scholarship, if that's where your heart takes you. I encourage you to do work that interests you. So just kind of figure that out. What's your passion? I know a lot of you are athletes, so it could be that you have some passion with athletics, or it could be you've got so many hours spent doing that you don't have time to explore, but when you do, have a breath. Consider it. Think about and research the phenomenon that's close to you. What do you have access to? What are you connected with? And then share your ideas in clear, compelling language. And I know that undergrad students sometimes struggle with their writing because they think they've got to conform to this jargon-laden style. of academic writing. But the more clear you are, and just let the words flow, the better you'll be able to convey your ideas. Try to ignore the hedonic treadmill of status seeking. So by that, the hedonic treadmill is this idea that you're just stuck. You're trying to get that no matter how much status you get, you never have enough status. It's not something that brings you happiness. So what brings people happiness is doing meaningful work, not getting praise from other people. And there'll be times when you get praise, and there'll be times when you'll get attacked. And I always like to use that image of, I think it was Buddha, I'm not sure who came up with it, of think about your ideas about yourself as a candle and a flame, and that you want to have a glass over the flame. You don't want to be, if you take the glass off the flame, you're going to be battered around by the winds of anyone's ideas. So you want to keep yourself, centered about what's important to you and not worry so much about what other people think. Actually, my favorite metaphysical thought right now is, it doesn't matter what other people think of you, it matters what you think of them. And that should be your starting point in your interactions with others. So, join conversations that are already happening, go outside the tower, talk with people who are different from you. Let the work be the reward, not, the grade or the publication. Understand your failures as expansion, as just a step on the journey. Encourage folks to follow their inner guidance, which is that emotional self that tells you what's right and wrong. And what I've done is I've allowed my whole life experience to be a vehicle for my work. And that's created a very meaningful and wonderful life for me. Even though I've had setbacks, lots of rejection along the way, it's been a fun trip so far. So thank you so much for coming, and I'm happy to take questions.
All right, Doug will bring questions for the audience. If we have questions submitted online as well.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking. It was really captivating. I was wondering if you would say a little bit more about why you're not a fan of call-out culture.
Okay, sure. Is everybody familiar with what call-out culture is? Will you explain it? Do you want to explain it?
I'm under the impression that call-out culture is when you call someone else out for not acting in accordance with your beliefs. So kind of what you hinted at is that perhaps you don't agree with what Lizzo did in terms of your definition of feminism, but you don't agree with calling her out because perhaps that's her own feminism.
Okay, good description. I'll just add a little bit onto it, which is call-out culture is politically correct culture. That kind of like, you didn't say this exact word right, and that means you must be X. And I think call-out culture is poisonous because what happens is, if you're a group of people that are working together to create some kind of social justice initiative or activism, you're stuck with each other, you're around each other a lot, and then you can't really get at the people very easily who are the ones who are doing the oppressing. So sometimes like negative feelings that you're feeling get taken out on each other. And I think that politically, like policing people's political correctness is a way to vent feelings that then make other people feel super bad, and then the group disbands and then nothing gets accomplished. So I don't want us to take our upset feelings about systems of oppression and take them out on each other. Not that we don't want each other to grow, and we don't want to say, hey, you maybe want to rethink that word, it means X. There's a nicer way to do that, be like, oh, like privately. Just, but embarrassing and humiliating someone in front of other people just creates negativity, which then is counterproductive to making social change.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. During your research, right here, sorry.
Oh.
With your research with the Pray the Gay the Way and including the Bible Belt, I was wondering if you came up on any research with the phrase, love the sinner, hate the sin, and your experience with that, if you could talk on that just a little bit.
Yes, I did hear that a lot. I heard that phrase a lot. And that is something that a lot of the folks that I had interviewed had heard that kind of terminology before. And I heard it a little bit myself. And are you asking what I think of it?
Speak on it a little more.
Okay, so love the sinner, hate the sin is a way to kind of soften homophobia, to say, we love you as a person, we just don't like your behavior. Your behavior is sin. And that's another illustration of how conservative Christian ideology is confused about orientation, because they're connecting behavior, they're equating behavior and orientation. And so what gay people hear when someone says that is just another version of homophobia, because they can't control who they love, who they're attracted to. So they're being told that they are, as a person, flawed, even though the person saying that is saying they're not saying that. In actuality, that's what's happening. And it just speaks to people's ignorance about sexual orientation.
Hi,
Hi.
Thank you for coming. So, I came from a very obviously conservative Baptist family. I grew up under the beliefs of, so, am I homophobic for basically not believing, I have no problem whatsoever, but I don't agree with the choice. But am I homophobic for that, for not agreeing? It's against my moral beliefs.
Well, you're framing it as choice. Do you think it's a choice? Is your sexual orientation?
No, I don't really know what you're saying, but I just morally don't believe in it. That's my beliefs.
And you're hopefully not gay.
No, I'm not.
Good, because you would have a problem there. That would be bad if you were.
Okay, I was just asking, is it bad that I am a Christian and I believe what I believe?
It's not up for me to decide what is good or bad for you, but I would think that if you have gay friends, they might find that hurtful, because it means you're saying that what they're doing, there's something wrong with them. And I don't think that's the message you want to give them. But it may be, I guess it's something for you to consider, but not for me to judge or decide for you.
Okay, I have a question over here.
Hi.
So my question is, going back to that picture that was up there, them, on the ledge with their shirts off. How do you make people understand that it's levels to viewing that picture?
That it's a what?
It's a level to viewing that picture. So say for instance, he said, they free, they having fun, you know what I'm saying? Then you point out that it's different because women are looked at differently for doing that. Well, he may, for instance, not be looking at them differently for doing that. He might just be acknowledging this aspect. How do you confront that?
Okay, well, you're getting into a lot of individual ideas about raunch culture, and we can experience it differently. And it's possible that the women up there are feeling very free, although that is a posed photograph that somebody designed. One way to think about it is to keep your eye on the structure as opposed to the individual. I like to use this metaphor when I talk about raunch culture. Have you all ever, do you know what Mountain Dew is? Or Coca-Cola, yeah, like a sweet, who's had yeah, okay. So I think of raunch culture like Coca-Cola, like the sugary caffeinated version. If we had Coke once a month with popcorn, that would be okay, not unhealthy. Even once a week, not so bad. But imagine that Coke was our only beverage ever. We had it for breakfast, we had it when we were exercising, we had it for lunch, we had Coke happy hour. We had Coke nightcaps. Everything was Coke all the time, right? We'd be poisoned, we'd be sick, we'd be thirsty. So I think of raunch culture like that. It's 100% raunch culture all the time. A little bit of raunch culture, fine, yay. Raunch culture 24/7 shapes us in ways that deserve to be interrogated, and that's what I'm doing.
We have time for one more quick question, and then I'm going to invite folks to talk to Dr. Barton afterward. But I see one more question over there. Oh, sorry. Yes. Sorry. Yes. Go with Lakia.
I think I can talk loud enough. But to the gentleman up there, this is more just a comment. Because we've had these kind of discussions before where somebody has been vulnerable and they've told us a little bit about an upbringing that they have. Let's be respectful of that, and hopefully people surround you and they can teach you and show you that like there's nothing wrong with loving other people, and all we can do is support somebody else's way to love. So just a comment to you out there, I don't want people to be like mean and hateful towards you, because we appreciate that you're vulnerable in this setting.
Thank you. I do invite anybody who wants to ask questions and didn't have a chance to ask theirs, please come speak to Dr. Barton. Thank you again.